The hallway beyond was swallowed in shadow, and the voice came again, softer this time. "Amelia, let me in." Her fingers hovered above the doorknob, her heart hammering in her chest. Was this some kind of joke? Had she been reading too many short, scary stories to read online? She wanted to believe it was all in her head, but the urgency in the voice made her hesitate. She twisted the knob and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, as if something was lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A chill ran down her spine. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, feeling the walls of the house close in on her. "Because I'm lonely," the voice replied, echoing from the darkness. The tone was almost pleading, pulling at her like the villain in the slasher novels she'd once been obsessed with, those killers who thrived in the dead of night, preying on those brave enough to face them. The voice beckoned again. "Amelia, open the door. Let me in." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body frozen in place. Fear and curiosity waged war within her. She could feel the pull, the magnetic draw of the voice. In her mind, she pictured what could be waiting beyond the threshold, a specter from one of the top horror novels, or perhaps something far more sinister, something even those terrifying, scary stories to tell had never quite prepared her for. But deep down, she knew this was no scary short story to read online. This was her life, and the choice she made tonight could change everything. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Whatever was out there, whatever waited for her, she had to face it. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door handle again, pulled it open, and stepped into the unknown. As Amelia faces her darkest fears, what would you do? Have you ever experienced a chilling moment like this? If you're enjoying these twists and turns, don't forget to hit that like button. Your thoughts on Amelia's choices, share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear. And if you crave more of these scary stories to read in the dark, make sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales. You won't want to miss what happens next. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was a crisp autumn evening, and as the leaves crunched underfoot, Ben watched his reclusive neighbor, Mr. Gordon, slip out of his house yet again. Mr. Gordon had always been a mystery, keeping to himself, rarely speaking to anyone. His late-night walks had recently become more frequent, happening at the oddest hours, just after midnight or sometimes at dawn. Ben couldn't help but be curious. After all, he'd always been a fan of good horror novels and loved delving into scary stories to read in the dark. But now the mystery was real, right in front of him, in his own neighborhood. Initially, Ben dismissed his curiosity, convincing himself that everyone had their routines. However, as the weeks passed, the urgency in Mr. Gordon's movements during these midnight walks piqued his interest. One night, after reading one too many short, scary stories to read online, Ben's curiosity finally got the better of him. He grabbed his jacket, slipped on his sneakers, and decided to follow Mr. Gordon. The crisp air bit at his skin as he kept his distance, hiding behind bushes and parked cars. Mr. Gordon, oblivious to being watched, walked with purpose. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, his head lowered as he made his way towards the woods that bordered their peaceful neighborhood. Ben hesitated for a moment at the edge of the tree line. The woods loomed dark and forbidding, like the setting of a scene from the top horror novels or one of those slasher novels he had read. He could almost imagine hearing the distant whisper of a voice saying, "Turn back," but he couldn't. Curiosity had its grip on him. He stepped into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet unnervingly loud in the stillness. He could see Mr. Gordon in the distance, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. The path twisted deeper into the forest, and Ben followed quietly, feeling a familiar, unnerving sensation crawling up his spine. It reminded him of those scary campfire stories he'd heard as a kid, the ones that left you looking over your shoulder long after the fire had died out. Mr. Gordon stopped at a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and boarded up. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. yet Mr. Gordon approached it with an unsettling sense of familiarity. Ben ducked behind a tree, watching as his neighbor hesitated at the door. For a long moment, Mr. Gordon simply stood there, as if weighing his options. Then, without looking back, he opened the door and disappeared inside. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't one of those short horror stories to read online. This was happening right now. What could Mr. Gordon possibly be doing in that cabin at this hour? The thrill of the unknown washed over Ben, mingling with a growing sense of dread. He knew he should turn back, but something inside him urged him forward. He crept closer, staying low, until he reached the side of the cabin. The door had been left slightly ajar, and through the crack, Ben could see faint light flickering inside. His breath caught in his throat as he caught sight of Mr. Gordon standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by strange objects. Old photographs lined the walls, faces twisted in anguish, their eyes wide with terror. Ben's stomach churned. He recognized some of the people in those photos. They were neighbors, all of whom had gone missing over the past few years. His hands trembled as he pulled back from the door. He had uncovered something far worse than he had ever imagined. Mr. Gordon wasn't just a strange man taking midnight walks. No, this was something far more sinister, like the twisted villains in horror novels 2022. Ben tried to back away quietly, but as he turned, his foot snapped a branch beneath him. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent night. He froze. Mr. Gordon's head snapped toward the door, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "Who's there?" Mr. Gordon's voice was low, menacing. Panic surged through Ben as he ducked behind the nearest tree, his heart pounding in his ears. He prayed Mr. Gordon hadn't seen him. The footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. Ben could barely breathe, each second stretching into eternity. Just as he was about to make a run for it, the door creaked open. Ben dared a glance around the tree and saw Mr. Gordon standing in the doorway, scanning the area. His breath was visible in the cold night air, and his eyes were sharp, like a predator searching for its prey. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Gordon turned back inside, muttering something to himself. The door creaked shut behind him. Ben didn't waste a second. He bolted through the woods, his feet barely touching the ground as branches whipped at his face and snagged his clothes. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his own house, slamming the door behind him. His mind raced with the horrific images from the cabin. He had never believed in monsters, but now he knew better. Sometimes they lived right next door. Dust motes danced in the dim light of the attic as Hannah sifted through old boxes, rediscovering the pieces of her family's history. It had been years since anyone had ventured up here, and each box seemed to hold a forgotten fragment of the past. She pushed aside old clothes, forgotten toys, and a few knickknacks, not expecting to find anything of significance. But then, tucked away at the bottom of one box, she found a faded envelope. Intrigued, she pulled it out and gently opened it. Inside was an old family photo, yellowed with age, the edges frayed. The image captured a sunny day, a family picnic in the park, with everyone gathered around a checkered blanket. Laughter seemed to echo from the photo, drawing Hannah in as she studied the familiar faces. Her grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, they were all there, youthful and full of life. But something was wrong. As she looked closer, her stomach churned. Every face in the photo was crossed out with thick black lines. Every face except for one. Her mother. The sight unsettled Hannah deeply. Why would someone do this? The scene reminded her of the haunting scenes she had read in short, scary stories to read online, where innocent objects became symbols of something much darker. She turned the photo over, but there was nothing written on the back, just the rough texture of aged paper. Questions swirled in her mind as she clutched the photo in her hand. What had happened to those people? Why was her mother's face the only one left untouched? Unable to shake the eerie feeling, Hannah descended the attic stairs, her heart pounding. She found her mother in the kitchen, carefully slicing into a freshly baked apple pie. The warm scent filled the air, but it did little to calm the chill creeping down Hannah's spine. Mom, Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I show you something?" Her mother looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern when she saw Hannah's pale face. "Of course, sweetie. What is it?" Hannah laid the photo on the kitchen table, careful not to smudge the surface. Her mother's gaze fell upon the image, and Hannah watched as her expression changed first to confusion, then to something much darker. A shadow of sorrow crossed her face, and she sighed deeply. "Where did you find this?" her mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," Hannah replied, sitting across from her. "Mom, why are their faces crossed out?" A long silence stretched between them, the ticking of the kitchen clock growing louder with every second. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice heavy with regret. "It's a complicated story," she began, looking out the window as though the answers were hiding somewhere in the familiar view of their backyard. That day in the photo. It was one of the happiest days our family ever had. We were celebrating your uncle's return from the military, but shortly after that, everything changed. Hannah's heart sank. She had read about families hiding dark secrets in horror novels, but this was too real. A few months after that picture was taken, your uncle had a terrible car accident, her mother continued, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't survive. It shattered our family. People stopped coming around, distanced themselves. The grief was too much. Hannah's throat tightened. In the crossed-out faces, she asked quietly. Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. After the accident, it became too painful for some of the family to stay in touch. They drifted away, and one by one, they disappeared from our lives. I marked their faces as a way of coping, a way of remembering who was still part of our family and who was gone. Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes. It felt like the kind of loss she'd read about in good horror novels, where emotional scars ran deeper than any ghost or monster. "I kept the photo all these years," her mother said, her voice trembling. "It was the only thing I had left to remind me of what we lost." Hannah reached out, placing a comforting hand on her mother's. "Mom, I wish I'd known sooner. We could have talked about it, together." Her mother smiled softly, though it was tinged with sorrow. "I didn't want to burden you with it, but maybe it's time we start making new memories." As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm golden glow across the room, Hannah realized that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still unwritten. Maybe they could reclaim some of what was lost and build new memories that honored the love that remained. Together, they tucked the photo away in a safe place, a symbol of the pain and the hope that lingered in their family's history. The early morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor as Mark unzipped his tent. The crisp air was invigorating, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. This was his first solo camping trip, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and immerse himself in nature's embrace. Mark had always been drawn to the wilderness, often reading good horror novels about campers who found themselves in terrifying situations. But this trip was supposed to be different, peaceful. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, Mark decided to explore the area. The woods felt alive with the symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves. He wandered deeper into the forest, marveling at how the light played through the trees. Each step felt like a release from the pressures of the city, a freedom that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hours into his hike, Mark found a small clearing with a pristine stream bubbling nearby. It was the perfect spot to rest, so he sat on a large rock, dipping his fingers into the cool water. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of nature wash over him. But then he heard something. A faint crackle, like a twig snapping. His eyes shot open as he instinctively scanned the surrounding trees. At first he saw nothing, just the woods, quiet and still. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darted between the trees. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was just a deer, or maybe a playful squirrel. After all, he had read plenty about the wildlife in the area, and it wasn't uncommon to encounter animals while hiking. But this felt different. The shadow was larger, more deliberate in its movement. It reminded him of the ominous figures described in scary stories to read in the dark, those unsettling presences that seemed to watch from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. He shrugged it off, attributing his unease to the isolation. Maybe he had been reading too many short horror stories to read online lately. The woods had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you were alone. After a while, Mark gathered his courage and decided to continue his exploration. He wandered deeper into the forest, fascinated by the intricate patterns of light and shadow. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and he knew he'd have to head back to his campsite soon. That's when he felt it again, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Mark turned abruptly, half expecting to find a curious animal watching him from a distance. But there was nothing, just trees. The feeling persisted, though the weight of being watched, a presence lurking just out of sight. It was unsettling, like something straight out of one of the scary campfire stories he'd grown up hearing. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to him. When he finally reached his campsite, he took a deep breath, relieved to be back in the familiar surroundings of his tent and fire pit. Mark set about gathering firewood, trying to focus on the task at hand. But every time he glanced over his shoulder, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The sun had set now, and the forest had transformed into a dark, whispering maze. He lit a small fire, the flickering flames casting warm light around him. The sound of crickets filled the night air, but it did little to soothe his nerves. He cooked a simple dinner, but his appetite had all but disappeared. As the night deepened, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down his spine. Mark told himself he was being foolish, just paranoid. He had spent too many nights reading slasher novels and top horror novels where campers never made it out of the woods. But still, he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. Deciding to turn in early, Mark sought refuge in his tent, zipping it up tight and hoping the thin nylon walls would provide some comfort. But sleep wouldn't come. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with images of the shadow he'd seen earlier. Was it really just his imagination? Just as he began to doze off, a loud crack echoed through the stillness. Mark jolted awake, adrenaline surging through him. The noise had come from just beyond the trees, near where his fire had burned down to embers. He lay still, listening. The night was eerily quiet now. The usual sounds of the forest had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence. Minutes felt like hours, and just as Mark was about to convince himself it was nothing, he heard it again, a soft whispering, too faint to make out, yet undeniably present. His breath quickened as the whispers grew closer, circling his campsite, lingering just outside the reach of the dying firelight. He could almost imagine the dark shapes from horror novels he had read, slipping silently through the trees. Unable to take it any longer, Mark unzipped his tent and peered into the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that danced among the trees. He scanned the area, his heart racing. Then he saw a figure, half hidden behind a tree. Mark's blood ran cold as he squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. Was it a trick of the light, or was someone or something watching him? "Hello," Mark called out, his voice shaky, betraying his fear. No response, just silence. Mark took a cautious step forward, the underbrush crunching beneath his feet. The figure shifted, and in that moment something primal took over. He turned and fled back into his tent, his mind a whirlwind of panic. He fumbled with the zipper, hands trembling as he sealed himself inside. He held his breath, straining to hear any sounds outside, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding like a drum. The whispers returned, closer now, circling his tent like a predator stalking its prey. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, wishing it all away. Just as he thought it might be over, there was a loud thud against the side of his tent, sending a shockwave of fear through him. The forest, which had once felt like a refuge, now loomed with dread. Mark lay there, wide awake, praying for dawn to break. But deep down, he knew that whatever had been watching him wasn't finished yet. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Grace sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and flipping through a stack of old photographs. Each image captured a memory, a moment in time that seemed so vivid, yet so distant. There were laughter, adventures, and secrets. Her friendship with Olivia had been one of the brightest threads woven into the fabric of her life. 3 years had passed since that tragic day when everything changed. Olivia had been full of life, a spark of joy wherever she went. But a sudden accident had stolen her away, leaving Grace with a void that she still struggled to fill. Since then, Grace had learned to navigate her grief, cherishing the memories while grappling with the silence Olivia left behind. As Grace sifted through the photos, she stumbled upon one of their last adventures together, a weekend camping trip in the woods. They had spent hours around the campfire, telling scary campfire stories and laughing until their sides hurt. Olivia's smile had been infectious, her spirit unbreakable. It was hard to believe that such joy could be eclipsed by loss. Suddenly, Grace's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tranquility of the moment. She glanced down, and her heart skipped a beat. The message on the screen was from Olivia's number. "I'm in trouble," the text read. Grace froze. Her mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, but none of them made sense. Olivia was gone. She had been gone for 3 years. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. But deep down, something stirred, a chill creeping up her spine, as if this was something out of one of those short horror stories to read online that always kept her awake at night. Pushing aside the disbelief, Grace typed back a response, her fingers trembling. "Olivia, is this really you?" She hesitated before hitting send. Was she losing her mind? But in her heart there was a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was some bizarre twist of fate. Seconds stretched into eternity, and each tick of the clock amplified her anxiety. Finally, her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to reality. "You need to help me. I don't have much time." Panic surged through Grace. How was this possible? How could Olivia be reaching out from beyond? The urgency in the message was unmistakable. It echoed through Grace's mind, bringing her back to the night of Olivia's accident, a night filled with unanswered questions and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She typed another message, her heart racing. "Where are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "The old cabin. The one we used to visit. Please hurry." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The old cabin. It was deep in the woods, the very place where they had shared some of their happiest moments. They hadn't been back since the accident. She had avoided it, unable to bear the memories. But now, the thought of Olivia possibly in danger pulled her from her seat. Grace grabbed her car keys and rushed out the door. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions as she drove. The familiar roads felt strange, each turn bringing back memories of laughter and carefree days. But now the weight of the past pressed heavily on her chest, mingling with the urgency of the present. When she finally arrived at the cabin, a sense of foreboding settled over her. Trees loomed large and dark, casting eerie shadows that flickered in her peripheral
I have
vision.
another half a day left.
The cabin, once a place of joy, now stood silent and unsettling. Its worn facade seemed to whisper secrets long forgotten, like the characters in the horror novels Grace had always loved reading. She stepped out of the car, the air thick with anticipation. Every scary story to tell she had ever heard replayed in her mind, warning her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not when Olivia needed her. Grace pushed open the creaky cabin door, her pulse quickening. Inside, everything was as they had left it, dusty, but familiar. The fireplace where they had roasted marshmallows still held the cold remnants of ash, a haunting reminder of happier times. Olivia Grace called out, her voice trembling. Only silence answered her. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning every corner for any sign of her friend. In the back room, something caught her eye, a small object on the mantel. She approached it cautiously and realized it was Olivia's locket. The very one she had worn the night of the accident. Grace's hands shook as she picked it up, her heart pounding. Inside the locket was a picture of the two of them, smiling brightly against a backdrop of autumn leaves. But there was something else tucked inside a folded piece of paper. Grace's breath caught as she unfolded it, her mind racing with possibilities. The words scrawled across the paper sent a chill down her spine. Grace, not everything is as it seems. Trust your heart. She stood frozen, the world around her spinning. The messages. The locket. Olivia's voice in her mind, urging her to understand. Suddenly, everything clicked. The texts, the memories, the overwhelming feeling of connection. Olivia wasn't just sending a message from the beyond, she was reminding Grace of something deeper. Something that transcended time and space. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she whispered into the empty room, "Olivia, I wish I could have saved you." As the last words left her lips, a soft breeze swept through the cabin, carrying with it the warmth of remembrance. Grace felt a presence, an undeniable feeling that Olivia was there with her, guiding her through the darkness. Clutching the locket tightly, Grace made a promise. She would carry Olivia's spirit with her, honoring her memory with every step she took. She wasn't alone. She never had been. After moving into her new apartment, Emma felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The one-bedroom unit was cozy, located in an older building with creaky floors and charmingly mismatched fixtures. The first few days passed quickly as she unpacked boxes and settled in. It felt like a fresh start, and Emma was ready for it. But soon, unsettling things began to happen. It started with a simple note. One morning, Emma found a piece of paper folded neatly on her kitchen counter. It was an odd discovery, as she didn't recall leaving any notes around. Curiosity piqued, she unfolded the paper to find the handwriting neat and precise, almost too perfect. "Don't forget to water the plants," it read. Emma didn't own any plants. She chuckled, assuming it was a mistake, perhaps left by the previous tenant. But as the days passed, more notes appeared, and each one was more unsettling than the last. Emma felt like she had stepped into one of those short, scary stories to read online, the kind that started innocently enough before things spiraled out of control. One morning, she found another note taped to her bathroom mirror. "The hot water runs out faster than you think," it said. Emma paused, thinking back to her shower the previous day. The water had gone cold sooner than usual, but she brushed it off as a minor inconvenience. Now it felt more like a warning. It was becoming clear that the notes were not random, they were personal. Someone had been watching her. The realization sent a chill down her spine, reminding her of the unsettling suspense she often read in horror novels. Trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, Emma convinced herself it was all a coincidence. But the more she tried to ignore the notes, the more persistent they became. Another appeared on her bedside table. "Don't leave the window open tonight." It was a warm evening, and she had indeed left her window open, something she rarely did. That's when she knew this was no coincidence. Someone or something was watching her. It felt like one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the protagonist slowly realizes they're being hunted, their every move monitored by a faceless figure. Emma couldn't ignore it any longer. She began to monitor her own surroundings, leaving her apartment and lingering in the hallway, pretending to check her phone while glancing at her neighbors' doors. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She kept her doors locked, her curtains drawn, trying to fortify her space against the unknown. Then, another note appeared, more chilling than the rest. She found it lying on her coffee table after returning from a grocery run. "Enjoy your tea, but be careful with the sugar." Emma froze. She had just made a cup of tea, but she hadn't added sugar. The implication of the note hit her like a wave of ice. Someone was not only watching her, but they knew the details of her daily routine. This wasn't just a scary short story to read online, this was her life. Frustrated and terrified, Emma decided to confront her tormentor. She wrote a note of her own, slipped it under her front door, and waited. It was a simple message, written in trembling handwriting. "Stop. I know you're watching me." For days, there were no new notes. The silence was almost suffocating, but Emma allowed herself to relax, believing the strange ordeal was over. Maybe whoever had been watching her had decided to move on. But then, just as she was starting to feel safe again, another note appeared. This one was different, tucked inside the pages of a book she had been reading, a good horror novel she had picked up recently to distract herself. "You should know I have your back," the note read. Emma's heart raced. This wasn't a prank. It felt like a game she didn't want to play, a cruel twist straight out of the slasher novels she'd seen in movies, where the protagonist realizes they are never alone, even in their most private moments. The walls of her apartment began to feel like a prison, the shadows lengthening with each passing day. Desperation crept in, mixing with her growing paranoia. She installed a small security camera at her front door, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was tormenting her. She spent hours reviewing the footage, looking for any sign of movement, but nothing seemed out of place. The hallway was always empty, the door remained closed, but the notes continued. One night, Emma found a note on her pillow, sending a jolt of fear through her. "I'm closer than you think." That night, she lay wide awake, every sound amplified in the silence. She could barely close her eyes, terrified of what might happen next. The familiar details of her apartment, the comforting glow of the streetlights outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator now felt sinister, as if they were hiding something she couldn't see. In a last-ditch effort, Emma decided to seek help. She uploaded the security footage and her story to an online community, hoping for advice. The responses flooded in, a mix of sympathy, disbelief, and suggestions. Some people told her to confront her neighbors. Others advised her to call the police. But no one had concrete answers. That evening, another note appeared. This time it was different, tucked into a place she would never have expected, inside her shoe, right where she'd have to find it before leaving the apartment. "I'll see you soon." Emma's blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they were bolder now, unafraid to cross boundaries. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she did, this game of cat and mouse was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty street as Lauren leaned against the cool brick wall of her favorite cafe. The familiar scent of coffee and baked goods filled the air, but today her stomach was heavy with something else, an uneasy anticipation. Her brother Jason had just left to run a quick errand. She watched as he turned the corner, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Lauren could remember the exact moment it happened. A sudden shout echoed through the street, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps. She pushed off the wall, her heart racing. A figure darted past her, tall and wiry, clutching Jason's backpack. Panic surged through her as she realized that the bag held more than just his laptop. In school books, it contained precious keepsakes, irreplaceable items that Jason always carried with him. Before Lauren could react, Jason was already in hot pursuit, shouting after the thief. The man glanced back, his face set in a wild expression, determination flashing in his eyes. Jason's long strides quickly closed the gap between them, but the thief had a head start. Lauren stood frozen, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Should she run after them? Should she stay behind and call for help? The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as she watched them disappear around the corner. She took a deep breath and pushed through the cafe door, trying to steady herself. The world around her felt suddenly too quiet, too still. They reminded her of the tense moments in the top horror novels she had read, the calm before everything went terribly wrong. The street was bustling with people. But time seemed to slow down as Lauren scanned the area, desperately searching for any sign of Jason or the thief. Her thoughts raced as she considered what might happen if Jason caught up to the man. What if the thief was armed? What if Jason got hurt? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where everything spirals out of control before you even know what's happening. With her heart pounding, Lauren hurried down the sidewalk, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. She rounded the corner, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, but the street was empty. The city, once alive with energy, now felt eerie and desolate. "Jason," she shouted, her voice bouncing off the nearby buildings. Silence answered her. A growing sense of dread pooled in her stomach as she retraced their possible route. Each corner she turned held the promise of finding them, but time and again, she was met with nothing but empty streets. It felt like she was living in a horror novel, the kind where the protagonist is forced to navigate a labyrinth of suspense and fear, all the while knowing that something is terribly wrong. Lauren's phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. She fumbled to answer it, hoping it was Jason, but it wasn't. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen, the words sending a chill down her spine. "I have your brother. If you want him back, meet me at the old warehouse by the docks." For a moment, everything around Lauren seemed to blur. Her mind raced, her hands trembling as she read the message again. Could this be real? It felt like she had stepped into the plot of one of those slasher novels she loved, where the protagonist has to make life or death decisions in the face of unimaginable danger. Her instincts screamed at her to call the police, to stay put and let the authorities handle it. But another part of her, the part that couldn't bear the thought of Jason in danger, urged her to act. She couldn't just sit by and wait. With her heart pounding in her chest, Lauren made her decision. She grabbed her jacket and keys, ready to face whatever awaited her at the docks. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting an ominous orange glow over the city. It felt like the setting of a scary campfire story, the kind where the tension builds until the air is so thick with fear that you can barely breathe. The drive to the docks was a blur. Every turn felt like it was leading her further away from safety, deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The world outside the car window seemed foreign, twisted by her anxiety. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, each thud reminding her that time was running out. When she finally arrived at the old warehouse, the area was eerily quiet. The building loomed ahead of her, its faded exterior draped in shadows. Lauren swallowed hard and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with dread, and every part of her screamed to turn back. But she couldn't. She made her way to the entrance, her hands trembling as she pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the setting sun through the broken windows. It felt like the climax of one of those scary stories to read in the dark, the kind where you know the worst is just around the corner. "Jason," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. No response. Just silence. Her phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen illuminating the darkness. Another message from the same unknown number come inside. "You're almost there." Lauren's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, stepping further into the warehouse. Her footsteps echoed, each step amplifying the tension that hung in the air. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound magnified by the silence. It reminded her of the short horror stories to read online that always seemed to get under her skin, making her question every little thing around her. Suddenly, she heard a soft noise. It was faint, but unmistakable, Jason's voice. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, pushing past old crates and abandoned equipment until she reached the back of the warehouse. There, in the dim light, she saw Jason tied to a chair, his eyes wide with fear. "Lauren," he called out, struggling against his bonds. She rushed to him, her hands working quickly to untie the ropes. But just as she loosened the last knot, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." Lauren spun around, her heart pounding as a figure stepped out of the darkness. If this story left you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if you were in Lauren's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. And if you enjoy scary stories to tell like this, make sure to subscribe for more heart-pounding tales. You won't want to miss what happens next. In the heart of the city, a sprawling park offered a quiet escape from the urban rush. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Mia decided to take a leisurely stroll, her feet crunching through the golden leaves that covered the ground. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the endless tasks that awaited her: work deadlines, social obligations, and the constant buzz of life. But here, in the serenity of the park, everything seemed to fade away. As she walked along the path, admiring the trees illuminated by the soft sunlight, she noticed a figure in the distance. At first, the person blended into the background, just another face in the crowd. But as Mia looped around a bend, she caught another glimpse, and her heart skipped a beat. The woman in the distance looked eerily familiar. Long dark hair fell over her shoulders, her features sharp as though chiseled from stone. What unsettled Mia was that the woman wasn't just anyone, she looked exactly like her. It felt like something out of one of those horror novels Mia often lost herself in, where the main character is haunted by a strange doppelganger. Mia shook her head, brushing it off as a trick of the light. But as she continued her walk, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It reminded her of the unsettling tension she felt when reading scary short stories to read online, where the protagonist slowly realizes that something or someone is following them. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw the woman again, closer this time. Their eyes locked for a brief moment. Mia's heart raced as she picked up her pace. Was this woman following her? Was it just her imagination? She tried to tell herself that this was a public park, filled with people, and it was nothing to worry about. But as she quickened her pace, so did the woman. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She had read plenty of scary stories to tell around a campfire growing up, and one thing she had learned was to trust her instincts. Something about this situation felt wrong. Every fiber of her being urged her to leave the park, but the rational side of her argued against it. Maybe it was just coincidence, she thought. Maybe this woman wasn't following her at all. Despite her attempts to rationalize it, the tension gnawed at her, just like the fear she'd felt while reading top horror novels. She walked faster, her eyes darting around, searching for an exit. The laughter of children and the distant hum of city life faded into the background as Mia's focus narrowed on the woman. The stranger matched her every movement, her long strides mirroring Mia's. Panic surged through Mia as she turned a corner, finding herself alone on a secluded path. Her heart pounded in her chest as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sense of foreboding. It was like she had stepped into one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the setting seems peaceful until everything goes wrong. Mia spun around, prepared to confront the woman, but when she turned, the woman was gone. The path behind her was empty, silent, as though the stranger had never been there at all. Mia stood frozen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Had she imagined it? She took a few hesitant steps forward, glancing around, her nerves still on edge. That's when she heard a soft rustling behind her. Mia whipped around, her eyes wide, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Her pulse quickened as the shadows seemed to lengthen around her, the once peaceful park now feeling like the setting of a slasher novel. And then she saw her. The woman was standing just a few feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes locked onto Mia's with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Mia took a step back, her mind racing. This felt too real to be her imagination, but it also felt impossible. Who was this woman, and why did she look exactly like her? Summoning her courage, Mia called out, her voice shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, watching, her eyes boring into Mia's. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice soft and hauntingly familiar. I am you. Mia's heart stopped. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman took a step forward, her figure eerily graceful, like she was gliding through the air. I am everything you fear, everything you run from. Mia's breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. It felt like she had stepped into the pages of one of those horror novels 2022 that kept her up at night, where the protagonist's darkest fears manifest before their eyes. The woman's gaze softened as she moved closer. You can't run from yourself, Mia. Mia stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? She had read good horror novels before, but nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her to face herself, literally. I don't know what you are, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. But you're not me. The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. I am the part of you that you refuse to see. The part you've buried deep down, hoping it would disappear. But I'm still here, and I always will be. Mia's back hit the trunk of a tree, her escape route blocked.
لصراعات وخصومات نحن في غنى عنها. العالم اليوم
like a mirror
راهو عالم
reflecting Mia's
متوحش.
deepest insecurities.
نحتاج أن نبنوا
You need to
المغرب
accept me, the woman said, her voice soft yet firm. Only then can you be free. Mia felt tears prick at her eyes. The weight of the woman's words crushed her, forcing her to confront everything she had been avoiding. But as she stood there, face to face with her own fears, something shifted inside her. She realized that maybe, just maybe, this woman wasn't her enemy. Maybe she was her strength. Mia took a deep breath, her heart steadying. What do I have to do? The woman's smile softened. You already know the answer. And just like that, the woman began to fade, her figure dissolving into the golden light of the park. Mia stood there, breathless, as the tension lifted, leaving her with a strange sense of peace. As the last rays of sunlight streamed through the trees, Mia understood. She wasn't running anymore. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like this video. Have you ever confronted your deepest fears? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoy eerie tales like this, make sure to subscribe for more scary stories to read in the dark. There's plenty more to come. The soft hum of rain against the windows filled the room as Sophia curled up on her couch with a steaming cup of tea. It was her favorite time of year, cool autumn nights, perfect for losing herself in the pages of her favorite horror novels. The latest one she'd picked up, a bestseller among horror novels 2022, was gripping, filled with eerie tales of haunted houses and restless spirits. Tonight, though, something felt off. The house was too quiet. Sophia pushed the unsettling feeling aside and continued reading. Outside, the rain grew heavier, each drop drumming harder against the glass. Just as she was getting to a particularly tense chapter, her phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table, startling her. The screen lit up with an unknown number. She hesitated, staring at the phone. Who could be calling her so late? Normally, Sophia would ignore unknown numbers, but something compelled her to answer this time. Maybe it was curiosity, the same curiosity that always led her to scary stories to read and the dark stories that made her question the safety of her own surroundings. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello. For a moment, all she heard was static, a crackling that sent a chill down her spine. She was about to hang up when a voice, barely audible, broke through the noise. Sophia. Help me. Her heart stopped. She gripped the phone tighter. Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling. The static intensified, and then, just as quickly, it cut off. The line went dead. Sophia stared at the phone in disbelief, her mind racing. The voice had been so familiar. It sounded like her old college roommate, Sarah, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She put the phone down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that settled over her. It was probably just a prank, or maybe she was imagining things. After all, she'd spent hours reading scary short stories to read online, the kind that made her jump at every sound. But deep down, Sophia couldn't let it go. There was something about that voice, it wasn't just a coincidence. She decided to text Sarah just to check in. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen as she typed a casual message. "Hey Sarah, it's been a while. Are you okay?" The minutes ticked by with no response. Sophia set her phone down, trying to focus on her book again, but the words blurred together as her mind kept returning to the call. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, the house now filled with an uncomfortable stillness. Then her phone buzzed again. She snatched it up quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Sarah's name on the screen. A single message appeared. "I need you." Sophia's pulse quickened. She typed a response, her hands shaking. "Sarah, where are you? What's going on?" The reply came almost instantly. "The cabin. Please hurry." Sophia's heart dropped. The cabin. They hadn't been there in years. It was an old place deep in the woods where they used to escape during college breaks, sharing laughter and scary campfire stories late into the night. But those memories had long since faded, overshadowed by the tragic accident that happened during their last trip. After that night, none of them had ever gone back. Panic rose in Sophia's chest. She couldn't shake the sense of dread settling over her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and jacket, bolting out the door. The drive to the cabin was long and treacherous, with the winding road slick from the rain. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the trees towering like silent sentinels as she sped through the forest. The road felt endless, her headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. As she drove, memories of that last trip surfaced. Sarah, always the life of the party, laughing and telling everyone to lighten up as they huddled around the campfire. That was the night they told the scariest of all scary stories to tell about a girl who disappeared in the woods and was never seen again. None of them had known then that their own night would end in tragedy. When Sophia finally arrived at the cabin, it looked exactly as she remembered, worn, weathered, and abandoned. The air was thick with tension, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows over the clearing. She parked and stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the moonlight air. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. Sophia hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not when Sarah had reached out to her. She couldn't leave her friend alone. With a deep breath, Sophia approached the cabin, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. She pushed open the door, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. Inside, the cabin was cold, empty. Dust covered every surface, and the faint smell of damp wood lingered in the air. There was no sign of Sarah. As Sarah Sophia called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The only sound was the soft dripping of water from a leak in the roof. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she ventured deeper into the cabin, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. She reached the main room and froze. There, in the middle of the floor, was a single object, Sarah's old backpack, the same one she had brought on their last trip all those years ago. Sophia's hands trembled as she knelt down, unzipping it. Inside was a faded photograph of the two of them, taken on the day of their arrival at the cabin. They were smiling, carefree, unaware of the darkness that was about to unfold. Sophia's phone buzzed again in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. Another message from Sarah. Turn around. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned, her eyes scanning the empty room. But there was no one there. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, a biting chill filling the air. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cabin into darkness. Sophia's phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with one final message. I'm not alone. Sophia's scream echoed through the empty cabin as she backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out. She turned and ran, bursting through the front door and into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands fumbling with the keys as she sped away from the cabin, the forest closing in around her. Whatever was waiting for her in that cabin, she wasn't ready to face it. It was late in the evening when Lucas finally sat down in his living room, feeling the exhaustion of the day wash over him. The old farmhouse, passed down through generations, creaked with age as the wind howled outside. The isolated location had always provided peace and quiet, but tonight, something felt different, something unsettling lingered in the air. Lucas had always loved good horror novels, especially the ones that made you question what was real and what was imagined. Tonight, though, the unease in the pit of his stomach wasn't fictional. The wind outside rattled the windows, but the farmhouse held steady as Lucas settled in for the night. His favorite chair creaked under his weight, and he began flipping through channels, trying to find something to distract himself. As he mindlessly scrolled through the TV,